Time to botch some names from the Renaissance. An Introduction to History of Psychology, Chapter 4, Renaissance Science and Philosophy. The Renaissance is generally dated from approximately 1450 to 1600. The Renaissance means rebirth, and during this period, the tendency to go back to a more open-minded method of inquiry, and that has been characterized by Greek philosophy. It was a time when Europe gradually switched from being God-centered to being human-centered. If God existed, he was manifest in nature. Therefore, to study nature was to study God. Also, because God has given humans the ability to create works of art, not exercise the ability to the why not exercise the ability to the fullest? And the new view was that there was more to humans than their souls. They had a sensory system, so why not use them? They had reasoning power, so why not exercise that? And they had the capacity for enjoyment, so why not enjoy? After all, God, in his infinite wisdom, must have given humans these attributes. Attention diverted from the heavens, whereas the medievals had focused it. To humans living in the world, nowhere is the spirit of the times better illustrated than in the work of the Renaissance humanists. Challenges to church authority. Let me put on my glasses. I can't say. The Renaissance and the breakdown of the church authority went hand in hand. Church dogma consisted of fixed truths. There were exactly 7 heavenly bodies in the solar system. The earth is the center of the universe, and humans are created in God's image, for example. Gradually, these truths were challenged, and each successful challenge focused suspicion on other truths. Once begun, the questioning escalated rapidly, and the church tried desperately to discourage these challenges to its authority. Church scholars attempted to show that contradictions were only apparent. Failing in this, they attempted to impose censorship, but it was too late. Gradually, church dogma was replaced by the very thing that has opposed the most, the direct observation of nature without the intervention of theological considerations. This transition, although steady, was slow and painful. There is no single reason for the reawakening of the spirit or of objective inquiry. Several factors believed responsible. One of Aquinas' acceptance of reason and the examination of nature is the ways of knowing God. Once sanctioned by the Church, the human capacity for reason was focused everywhere, including on church dogma. Another factor was the work of the humanists that we will consider next. Humanist philosophy recaptured the spirit of open inquiry reflected in the Greeks, and also stressed the human potential to act upon the world and change it for the better. In addition, 2 other broad events are considered key factors in the acceptance of the objective study of nature, because they weakened the authority of the church. The first of these was the exploration and contact with other peoples. For example, explorations of Central Asia and China, which was from 1271 to 1295 by Marco Polo. Discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus, 1492. Circumnavigation of the globe by Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, 1519 to 1522. Such events vastly expanded the known world. The discovery that the earth was filled with strange peoples and strange customs created many problems for the church. For example, a long debate occurred concerning whether savages found in America had rational souls. It was decided that they did. The second key event was Johannes Gutenberg's 1397 to 1468 invention of metal movable type, 1436 to 1444 in the West, thus creating modern printing techniques. The importance of printing cannot be overstated. Copying books by hand was slow work and both limited availability and stifled new thought. Obviously, for limited availability, only a relative few individuals might have ever had access to a given work. Beyond that, if you were a bright young medieval monk, which would you be more likely to painstakingly transcribe by hand, a classic work of relevance to theology, or your own ideas about some new matter of philosophy or natural science? Which would your church brethren think a better use of your time? The advent of printing changed all of that. Within just a few decades, the number of books increased dramatically. Literacy grew, as did many universities, and even genres of writing. Far more individuals had access to books, and now there was no need for a bright young mind to copy a classic work, freeing them to produce new scholarship instead. Widespread printing of the vernacular, the standard narrative language of locality or country, Bible paved the way for the Reformation, and outside of theology, printing facilitated the exchange of ideas required for advancing both philosophy and science, all of which we will consider subsequently. Let me highlight something. Pardon. Okay. As an aside, we should note that Gutenberg invented printing in the West. The West. Many key discoveries that would shape the Renaissance were first made in the East. We saw an importance of Islamic scholars in the reclamation of Aristotle in our last chapter, and commented that Islamic science was far ahead of Western science at the time. From the Islamic world, we also get our numerals and much of our math. In China, timekeeping, navigational devices such as the compass, both paper making and printing, as well as explosives and gunpowder, were all long established before they reached the West. Renaissance humanism. Major themes. The term humanism, as it applies to the Renaissance, does not mean humanitarianism. That is, it does not refer to a deep concern about the welfare of humans, nor does it refer to humanness, treating one's fellow human with respect, sensitivity, or dignity. As it applies to the Renaissance, humanism denotes an intense interest in human beings as if they were discovering ourselves for the first time. So during this time, interest was focused on a wide range of human activities. How do we think, behave, and feel? Of what are we capable? These related questions are reflected in the four major themes that characterize Renaissance humanism. Individualism, number one. There was a great concern with human potential and achievement, the belief in the power of the individual as opposed to the church or state, to make a positive difference in the world. The world created a spirit of optimism. Personal religion. Although all Renaissance humanists were devout Christians, they wanted religion to be more personal and less formal and ritualistic. They argue for a religion that could be personally experienced rather than one that the church hierarchy imposed on the people. Intense interest in the past. The Renaissance humanists became enamored with the past. The works of early Greeks and Roman poets, philosophers, and politicians were of special interest. Renaissance scholars wanted to read what the ancients really said instead of an official interpretation. These activities introduced Renaissance scholars to a wide range of viewpoints from the past, and many of these views found considerable support among the humanists. For example, 1462, Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, founded the Platonic Academy in Florence. He sought to do for Plato's philosophy what the scholars had done for Aristotle's. Among the humanists, almost every early Greek and Roman philosophy had its adherents, but Plato was especially influential. Even some Extremely old Eastern religions were rediscovered, stimulating great interest in the occult. Anti-Aristotelianism. Many of the humanists believed that the Church had embraced Aristotle's philosophy to too great an extent, to the point where Aristotle's philosophy was as authoritative as the Bible. Passages from Aristotle commonly settled theological disputes. To the humanists, this was ridiculous, because Aristotle had been only human, and like that human, he was capable of error. To the regret of the humanists, Aristotle's philosophy, along with the Christian theology, had been used to create a set of rules, regulations, and beliefs that one had to accept in order to be a Christian. Accepting church dogma became more important than one's personal relationship with God. Therefore, the humanists attacked church dogma harshly. Although there were many interesting Renaissance humanists, space permits only a brief review of a few of them. Francisco Petrarch. So influential was Francisco Petrarch, 1304 and 1374. Some of the historians argue that his writings marked the beginning of the Renaissance. Clearly all the themes discussed above are found in Petrarch's works. Above all, Petrarch was concerned with freeing the human spirit from the confines of medieval traditions. The main target of his attack was scholasticism. He believed that the classics should be studied as the works of humans, not interpreted or embellished by others. He had low opinion of those who used the classics to support their own beliefs, saying of these interpreters, like, those who have no notion of architecture, they make it with their profession to whitewash walls. As most Renaissance humanists did, Petrarch urged for the personal religion like that described by St. Augustine, a religion based on the Bible, personal faith, and personal feelings. He thought scholasticism is an attempt to make religion compatible with the Aristotelian rationalism. He made it too intellectual. Petrarch also argued that a person's life in this world was at least as important as life after death. God wanted humans to use their vast capabilities, not inhibit them. Petrarch argued. By actualizing the potential of God the potential God has given us, we can change the world for the better. By focusing the human potential, Petrarch helped stimulate the explosion of artistic and literary endeavors characterized by the Renaissance. Petrarch did not create anything new philosophically, but his challenge of religion and philosophical authority helped open the door for individuals such as Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. In other words, Petrarch's skepticism towards all forms of dogma helped pave the way to modern science. Giovanni Pico, 1463 to 1494, argued that God had granted humans a unique position in the universe. Angels are perfect and thus have no need to change, whereas non-human animals are bound by their instincts and cannot change. Humans alone, between angels and animals, are capable of change. We can choose to live sensual, instinctive lives, therefore become brutish, or to exercise our rational and intelligence, thereby becoming more angelic and godlike. Our freedom not only allows us to choose from a variety of lifestyles, but it also permits us to embrace almost any viewpoint. Pico insisted that all philosophies have common elements. For example, they reflect human rationality and individuality. He argued further that if properly understood, the major philosophical viewpoints were essentially in agreement. All viewpoints, therefore, could be studied objectively with the aim of discovering what they have in common. Pico urged that all philosophical perspectives being studied and assimilated into the Christian worldview. Clearly, Pico sought peace among philosophical and religious rivals. All humans' work, he said, should be respected. Had Pico's plea for individuals with different viewpoints to understand each other been heeded, perhaps the Inquisition could have been averted. This is not to be, however, and only the fact that Pico died so young spared him the sight of his books being burned. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 and 1536, was born in Rotterdam, the illegitimate son of a priest and a physician's daughter. A fact that depressed him all his life. He was eventually an ordained priest, but had no taste for a monastic life, preferring instead a life of study, travel, and independence. While earning a living as a tutor, his travels throughout Europe brought him into contact with many leading scholars. Erasmus was opposed to a fanatical belief in anything. He was fond of pointing out mistakes in the classics, claiming that everything created by humans could not be perfect. He challenged exorcism and alchemy as nonsense, attacking these and other forms of superstition. He begged people to take their lessons from the simple life of Jesus instead of from the prompt and circumstance of the organized church. He believed that the war was caused by fanaticism. He was especially disturbed by the bishop who became rich and famous because of war. Eclectic and practical, Erasmus was a keen observer of the world and its problems. Concerning women, Erasmus was both traditional and progressive views. He commended women for their role as caregivers, but argued contrary to the prevailing view that they should have access to education. He also argued against the idea that celibacy is superior to marriage. Erasmus completed his book, Praise of Folly, 1512, all the way to 1994. And in 1512, while staying with a friend, Sir Thomas More, in England, the book caused a sensation and was reprinted 40 times during his life. In it, he attacked the church and the papacy, philosophers, nobility, and superstitions of all kinds. He made the case that fools are better off than so-called wise persons because fools live in accordance with their true feelings instead of religions or philosophical doctrines. Fools, he said, are often happier because they do not fear death. They're not tormented by guilt. They do not fear ghosts, spirits, and goblins. They are not concerned about the future. Also, like non-human animals, drunkards and young children, fools are spontaneous and speak the truth. Clearly, Erasmus's philosophy had much in common with ancient cynicism. Erasmus was so critical of the excess of Catholicism that the adage developed that Erasmus laid the reformist egg and Luther hatched it. Erasmus' criticisms of the Catholic Church of his day closely paralleled those of Luther. The Pope had so far too much power, the preaching of indulgences, and had degenerated into shameless money-making. The veneration of saints had been corrupted by superstition. Church buildings were stuffed full of images. The music in services was more fitting for a wedding or of a drinking party. The Mass was served by priests who lived godless lives and served it as a shoemaker practices his trade. Confession had become money-making and skirt-chasing. Priests and monks were shameless tyrants. Perhaps in an effort to silence him, the Catholic Church secretly offered to make Erasmus a cardinal. This having failed, all of Erasmus's works were eventually placed in the Catholic Church Index of Forbidden Books. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. The Augustinarian priest and biblical scholar was disgusted by what Christianity had become in his day. Like many other humanists, his view of Christianity was much more in accordance with St. Paul's and St. Augustine's more than those of St. Thomas Aquinas. Human intentions are inspired either by God or by Satan. The former results of doing God's work, the latter in sin. People should not be able to escape the consequences of sin throughout penance or absolution. If they have sinned, then they should suffer the consequences, which should be eternal damnation. In the spirit of Augustinian theology, Luther insisted on an intensely personal religion in which each person is answerable only to God, and religion that de-emphasized ritual and church hierarchy. Traditionally, the Reformation is said to have begun in 1517, when Luther nailed his 95 theses, the challenges to church dogma and hierarchy, to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Aside from the issues already mentioned, Luther was especially opposed to the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, which allowed sinners to reduce the retribution for their sins by paying a fee to the church official. God alone, he preached, determines what is sinful and how sinfulness is to be treated. In Luther's eyes, the church had drifted far from the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. Jesus had preached the glory of the simple life, devoid of luxury and privilege, but the church had come to value these things, to engage in too many formal rituals. For Luther, the major reason for the downfall of Catholicism was its assimilation of Aristotle's philosophy. Luther on marriage. Luther also disagreed with the Catholic Church over the compulsory celibacy of nuns and priests. First, he noted that many church leaders lived in open liaison with mistresses and fathered illegitimate children. And like his contemporary Erasmus, he denounced the lawless clergy who went whoring or kept concubines. Second, Luther believed that married couples are capable of doing God's work, are just as capable of doing God's work as a nun or a priest. The mother suckling a baby and washing diapers, the father at work, the farmer at work, the couple having sex were as likely to engage in God-pleasing activities as the nun engaged in prayer. At age 42, Luther married Katrina von Bora, a former nun. By 1534, the Luthers had produced 6 children, 4 of whom survived. Luther celebrated sexual enjoyment within marriage and even entertained erotic thoughts. But what if a wife persistently denies her husband sexual satisfaction? In such case, Luther says, perhaps surprisingly, the husband might then turn to a household maid or someone else for sexual relations. Concerning a woman who wed an impotent man who nonetheless desires children, Luther gave this provocative advice. She, with the consent of the man, who is not really her husband, but only a dweller under the same roof with her, should have intercourse with another, for example, her husband's brother. They were to keep this marriage secret and ascribe any children to the so-called punitive father, such as a woman would be in a saved state and would not be displeasing to God. Luther's denial of free will. Luther and Erasmus had several disagreements, but perhaps one of the most intense was over free will. In 1524, Erasmus wrote The Free Will, and in 1525, Luther responded with The Bondage of the Will. Erasmus defined free will as the power of the human will whereby man can apply to or turn away from that which leads unto eternal salvation. Erasmus quoted numerous biblical passages where God indicates to humans what is good and what is evil and what encourages them to choose the former. This is pointed out was clearly true in the Garden of Eden, and the entire Holy Scripture is filled with such exhortations. Yes. Erasmus wrote, "Doesn't the reader of such passages ask, why do you, God, make conditional promises when it depends solely on your will? Why do you blame me when all my works, good or bad, are accomplished by you, and I am only your tool? Why bless me if I had done my duty, when everything is your achievement? Why do you curse me when I have merely sinned through necessity?" Without free will, humans cannot be held responsible for their actions. Inasmuch as a man can never be the author of good works, he can also never be called the author of evil ones. Erasmus argued that even if, contrary to what he believed, human actions are predestined, that it would be dangerous to reveal such a doctrine to the multitude, for morality is dependent on the consciousness of freedom. Erasmus' solution to the apparent contradiction between predestination and free will was to combine free will and God's grace. That is, those who choose well in their lifetime are granted eternal salvation. Contrarily, Luther said God foresees, purposes, and does all things according to his immutable, eternal, and infallible will. This thunderbolt throws free will flat and utterly dashes it to pieces. Why do humans perform evil deeds? Luther answered, "The human will is like that of a beast of burden. If God rides it, it wills and goes where hence God's will. If Satan rides it, it wills and goes where Satan wills. Nor may it choose to which rider it will run, nor which it will seek. But the rider themselves contend who shall have and hold it." He continued, "In all things pertaining to salvation or damnation, man has no free will, but is a captive, servant, and bondslave, either to the will of God or to the will of Satan. Still, God is all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and present everywhere, omnipresent. So how can he allow evil to exist?" Of course, this seems to give the greatest offense to common sense and natural reason that God, who is proclaimed to be so full of mercy and goodness, should of his own mere will abandon, harden, and damn men, as though delighted in the sins and eternal torments of the miserable. But it seems iniquitous, cruel, intolerable, to think thus of God. It has given offense to so many, and many great men down the ages. And who would not be offended? I myself have been offended at it more than once, even unto the deepest abyss of despair, so far that I wished I had never been made a man. Even with these concerns, Luther insisted, if the foreknowledge and the omnipotence of God were admitted, we must be under necessity. According to Luther, in the final analysis, Why God allows evil to exist is unfathomable to humans, and therefore must remain a mystery. In other words, God only knows. Although his debate with Luther, Erasmus was respectful, kind, and conciliatory. For example, he concluded, "When one has arrived at this view, others at that view, both reading the same scripture, it is due to the fact that each looked for something else and interpreted that which he read for his own purpose." However, Luther was often mean, disrespectful, and dogmatic. He insisted, for example, that his interpretation of Scripture was the only correct one, and he ended the debate by praying that the Lord would enlighten Erasmus on the subject of free will. It should be noted that despite his reputation for tolerance, Erasmus, like Luther, was fiercely anti-Semitic. And it was interesting that on the issue of free will, subsequent Lutheranism developed more into accordance with Erasmus's views than with Luther's. When Luther was excommunicated in 1521, the protest that he represented grew into a new religious movement, Protestantism. And Luther was its leader. The new religion denied the authority of the Pope and insisted that every individual had the right to interpret the Bible for himself and herself. To facilitate the latter, Luther translated the Bible into the German vernacular. The Catholic Church's response to the criticism of Luther and others was to make Aquinas' Christianized version of Aristotle's philosophy official church dogma, which all Christians were expected to follow. The dispute over which version of Christianity was correct soon divided Europe. Early Protestantism had at least two negative aspects. First, it was, as a religion, it was austere, harsh, and unforgiving. Austere. In terms of individual happiness, it is difficult to imagine its adherents being any better off than those embracing Catholicism. And second, Protestantism insisted on accepting the existence of God on faith alone. Attempting to understand him through reason or empirical observation was foolish and to be avoided. Thus, if one believes that the acceptance of reason and the observation of nature are ways of knowing God exemplified progress, then Protestantism exemplified regression. On the positive side, however, Protestantism was a liberating influence in the sense that it changed the authority of the Pope and of Aristotle, replacing them with the belief that individual feelings can provide the only truth needed to live one's life. And on an interesting note, that although the portrayal of Luther is often grim, he was known to have an earthly sense of humor. For example, he once observed, "My enemies examine all that I do. If I break wind in the Wittenberg, they smell it in Rome." For additional information concerning Luther's colorful life, including his confrontations with Erasmus and his influential theology, see Carey 2024. Mitchell D. Montaigne. Yeah, that'll work. Mitchell D. Montaigne. With the recovery of classical knowledge, there arose a concern that had occupied the Greek and Roman skeptics. With so many claims of truth, is there a valid way of distinguishing among them? The skeptics' answer was negative, and we see indications of skepticism in the work with Petrarch, Pico, and especially Erasmus. Luther demonstrated skepticism, at least towards the Aristotelian philosophy and the religious practices that developed since the time of Augustine. It is in the work of Michel de Montaigne. Okay, it's Michel de Montaigne-ish. Something like that. It's French, okay? So, it is in the work of Michel de Montaigne, 1533-1592. However we find the extreme skepticism that had been represented by Ferreau and Elise in Chapter 3, in a series of influential essays, Montaigne questioned the very possibility of the indisputable knowledge. Like Erasmus, he argued that both Catholic and Protestant theologies were equally indefensible on rational grounds, and that the only justifiable basis for religious conviction was faith. In sharp contrast to the earlier Renaissance humanist, Montaigne did not glorify human rationality, nor did he believe humans were superior to other animals. In this, he was in agreement with Erasmus. In fact, he argued that it was human rationality that caused most human problems, such as holy wars, and that because non-human animals lack rational powers, they are superior to humans. He analyzed the most famous philosophical doctrines, pointed out the contradictions within and among them, and showed them to be open to multiple interpretations. This is similar to what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, French, 1930 to 2004, became famous for doing many years later. Okay, so open to multiple interpretations. Montaigne rejected science as a means of attaining reliable knowledge because scientific truth is in constant flux. But he even went beyond the Greek and Roman skeptics by denying that Greek and Roman skeptics, by denying the simple sensations can act as a reasonable guide for living. Sensations, he says, are often illusory. And even if they were not, they are influenced by our bodily conditions and personal histories. It should be clear that Montaigne did not share the optimism expressed by the earlier Renaissance humanists concerning the human potential to make a positive difference in the world. Montaigne's skepticism stimulated a number of attempts to disprove it. For example, Popkin, 1967, argues that both Francis Bacon and René Descartes, both covered later on in this chapter, responded to Montaigne's doubts concerning human knowledge by creating philosophical systems that believed were impervious to such doubt. There were many other Renaissance humanists, such as Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, not only manifested the power of the individual thought through their famous art, but also provided detailed studies of human physiology as related to perception and behavior. Some, such as Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, are more associated with politics, although Machiavelli's classic work on interpersonal manipulation, The Prince, can still be read as a masterpiece of social psychology. Some, such as Juan Louis Vives, 1492 to 1540, is best known for their impact on pedagogy, advocating an educational system and understanding of human nature based on physiology. Clements, 1967, had suggested Vives as the first true psychologist. And some, such as William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1660, we know for their contributions to literature that continue to illuminate our understanding of the human condition. In all these cases, the emphasis was on the power of the individual to change things for the better, rather than simply accepting the world as it was. To say the least, the Renaissance was a paradoxical time. On one hand, there was an explosion of interest in human potential coupled with great human achievements. In this respect, the Renaissance resembled classical Greece. On the other hand, it was a time of persecution, superstition, witch hunting and execution, fear, torture, and exorcism. Although astrologers and alchemists were generally highly regarded as popular, abnormal individuals were often treated with extreme harshness. Wars destroyed much of France and Germany. The Black Death cut Europe's population by about a third. Major famines occurred, and syphilis was epidemic. Yet despite all of this trouble, there was almost unparalleled creativity. The Renaissance displayed the best and worst of humanity, the stuff from which modern philosophy and science emerged. Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. I got all those names right. In the 2nd century A.D., Ptolemy, the Greco-Egyptian, summarized the mathematical and observational astronomy of his time and that of antiquity in his Almagest. The Ptolemaic system included the beliefs that the heavenly bodies, including the Earth, were spherical in shape, and that the sun, moon, and planets travel around the Earth in orbits that are circular and uniform. Although the system reflects the views of most astronomers, including those of Aristotle, there were exceptions. A notable exception is Aristarchus of Samos, 310 to 230 BC. Okay, so we're going back now. The brilliant astronomer of the Alexandrian school. Aristarchus, we're going with that, believed that the Earth rotated on its own axis and that the Earth and other planets revolved around the sun. In other words, Aristarchus arrived at the basic assumptions of the Copernicus system about 1700 years before Copernicus. Despite a few such dissenters, the view of the universe reflected in the Ptolemaic system prevailed until the 17th century. The Ptolemaic system was resilient for at least 3 reasons. First, it accorded well with the testimony of the senses. The Earth does not appear to be the fixed center of the universe. It allowed for reasonable astronomical predictions. Later, it was congenital to Christian theology because it gave humans a central place in the universe and thus was in agreement with the biblical account of creation. In medieval theology, many of the teachings of Ptolemy, like those of Aristotle, became part of the official church dogma, were therefore unchallengeable. The worldview based on the Ptolemaic system became entrenched in philosophy, theology, science, and everyday. Nicolaus Copernicus. It was not until a devout canon of the Roman Catholic Church named Nicolaus Copernicus, born in 1473 to 1543, born in Turun, Poland, published his book De Revolutionibus Orbitum Coelestium, the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, that the Ptolemaic system was seriously challenged. Although reports on Copernicus's heliocentric theory had been circulating since about 1515, his De Revolutionibus was not published until 1543, the year he died. The book was dedicated to the Most Holy Lord Pope Paul III and promised to solve major problems with which the Church had been struggling, namely the creation of a more accurate calendar. The book, then, did not appear to be unfriendly towards the Church. Furthermore, De Revolutionibus was published. Its contents could be understood only by the most sophisticated mathematicians and astronomers of its day. Perhaps because its apparent compatibility with church dogma and its esoteric nature, the book was not immediately viewed as a threat to the Church, although it was eventually condemned. In any case, De Revolutionibus, they think that's it. Copernicus did argue successfully that rather than the sun revolving around the earth, the geocentric theory, the earth revolved around the sun, the heliocentric theory. The argument, of course, was a clear contradiction of church dogma. Only gradually was it realized that Copernicus's heliocentric theory questioned the traditional place of humankind in the universe. Once this realization occurred, a number of related questions followed. Were we favored by God, and therefore placed in the center of the universe? If not, why not? If the Church was wrong about this vital fact, was it wrong about other things? Were there other solar systems that contained life? If so, how were they related to ours? And which did God favor? Because Copernicus's heliocentric theory challenged a deeply held worldview going back at least to Aristotle, it was considered revolutionary. Common sense dictated the acceptance of the geocentric theory, and those rejecting it were considered either misinformed or insane. Within the Church, to challenge the geocentric theory was to challenge church dogma and was therefore heretical. Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, was a former Dominican priest who developed an interest in ancient philosophy of Hermeticism. Among other things, Hermetics profess the divinity of humans and the existence of magical forces that can be used to benefit humankind and the harmony amongst humans. The Hermetic tradition also held that that there are innumerable inhabited worlds, that is, solar systems, that in each of these worlds, according to our own, the sun is divine. For Bruno, the Copernican sun heralds the full sunrise of the ancient and true philosophy after its age-long burial in dark caverns. Bruno therefore accepted Copernicus's heliotropic theory, not so much for scientific reasons, but because it restored the divine status given to the sun by the ancients. All of this was too much for the Church, and Bruno was brought before the Inquisition in Venice on May 26, 1592. He was charged with 8 counts of heresy. At first, he recanted his beliefs and asked for mercy from the judge, but later he changed his mind, arguing that he had never been a heretic. 8 years after his imprisonment, Bruno was convicted as relapsed heretic on February 17, 1600, and was burned at the stake. Dang. It should not be concluded, however, that Bruno was a martyr for science. In the charges brought against him, Copernicus was not even mentioned. Dang. Often the reformers were as violent as those who they were attempting to reform. For example, the Protestant John Calvin ordered the famous anatomist Michael Servetus, 1511 to 1553, to be burned at the stake because he described the Holy Land as a barren wilderness, which it was, thus contradicting the scriptural description of it as the land of milk and honey. And the fate of individuals like Bruno and as Servetus helped explain the caution exhibited by scientists and philosophers during those times. Seriously. Copernicus was aware that Aristarchus had proposed a theory very similar to his many centuries before, and took some comfort in knowing this. Nonetheless, he realized that the heliocentric theory was nothing short of revolutionary, and that he was justifiably worried. Furthermore, Copernicus knew that despite the theology and philosophical turmoil caused by this theory, nothing in terms of scientific accuracy was gained by it. That is, the astrological predictions made by this theory were no more accurate than the ones made under the Ptolemaic system. Also, all known celestial phenomena could be accounted for by the Ptolemaic system. There were no major mysteries that needed explanation, and the only justification for accepting Copernicus's heliocentric theory was that it cast the known astrological facts into a simpler, more harmonious mathematical order. In the Ptolemaic system, it was necessary for the number of complex assumptions concerning the paths of the planets around the Earth. Once these assumptions were made, however, predictions concerning the paths of the planets and eclipses of the sun and moon could be made with considerable accuracy. What Copernicus's system did was reduce the number of assumptions needed to make those same predictions. As we have seen, a strong resurgence of interest in Platonic philosophy arose in the 15th and 16th century, and the Pythagorean aspect of the Platonicism was stressed during the revival. Working in favor of accepting the Copernican viewpoint was the Pythagorean Platonic view, that the universe operated according to mathematical principles, and that those principles were always the simplest and most harmonious possible. It was no accident that the first to accept Copernicus's theory was mathematicians, who, like himself, embraced the Pythagorean Platonic worldview. We have the Ptolemaic-Copernican debate. We have in the Ptolemaic-Copernican debate the first scientific revolution used by Kuhn. To use Kuhn's terminology, the Ptolemaic system represented the accepted scientific paradigm of the day. Like any paradigm, is defined by problems, specific solutions provided by those accepting it with a worldview. The Copernican paradigm focused on different problems, different methods of a solution, and distinctly different worldview, because to follow Copernicus was to reject the prevailing view of the universe. The opposition to his view was widespread and harsh. Converts to Copernicus's heliocentric theory came slowly. Among the first was Johannes Kepler, a Pythagorean Platonic mathematician. Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, was born at Weil in the Duchy of Württemberg, in what is now Germany. He first studied to become a Lutheran minister. Unable to accept the rigidity of Lutheran doctrine, switched to the study of mathematics and astronomy. Kepler was fortunate to have a teacher, Michael Maestlin, who encouraged a critical evaluation of both Ptolemaic and Copernican astrology, in spite of the fact that Luther had condemned the heliocentric theory as flagrant contradiction of biblical teachings. For example, Luther said, "The fool will turn the whole science of astronomy upside down, but as Holy Writ declares, it was the sun and not the earth which Joshua commanded to stand still." Other Protestant leaders joined the rejection of Copernicus. Calvin cited the opening verse of the 93rd Psalm, "The earth is established, it shall never be moved," and asked, "Who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit?" Thus there was a risk in embracing the Copernican theory, even for a Protestant, but embrace it was what Kepler did. There appeared to be two reasons Kepler took the risk. First, he, like Copernicus, was a Platonist, seeking the simple mathematical harmony that describes the universe. And second, like Bruno, Kepler saw the sun as a mystical force. And as such, he was attracted to the greater dignity given to the sun in the Copernican system. Throughout his life, he gave his reasons for accepting Copernican theory, and the enhanced position given the sun by that theory was always cited, and it was usually cited first. The keeping with his Pythagorean Platonic philosophy, Kepler believed that the true reality was the mathematical harmony that existed beyond the world of appearance, the sensory world. The world of appearance was an inferior reflection of the certain unchanging mathematical world. Armed with a mixture of Platonic philosophy, mysticism, and Copernican theory, Kepler not only made a living as an astrologer, he believed the heavenly bodies affect human destiny, but also made significant contributions to astronomy. He worked out and proved many of the mathematical details of the Copernican system, thereby winning its further acceptance. Through mathematical deduction and observation, he found that the paths of the planets around the sun were elliptical rather than circular, as Copernicus had believed. He observed that the velocities of the planets vary inversely with their distance from the sun, thus anticipating Newton's concept of gravitation. Finally, he demonstrated that all of the different planetary motions could be described by a single mathematical statement. Perhaps Kepler's most important contribution to science was his insistence that all mathematical deductions be verified by empirical observation. Kepler also studied vision directly and found that environmental objects project as inverted image into the retina. The observation contrasted with earlier theories that explained vision as a result of the projection of the exact copies of objects directly into the sense receptors. Kepler also questioned humans' abilities to perceive things correctly when the image projected onto the retina is upside down, but he is left with a problem for others to solve. Galileo Galilei, I think, 1564 to 1642, known simply as Galileo, born in Pisa, Italy, into the family of an impoverished nobility. He was a brilliant mathematician who, at the age of 25, was appointed professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa. Like Copernicus and Kepler, Galileo viewed the universe as a perfect machine whose workings could be understood only in mathematical terms. Philosophy is written in the great book which ever lies before our eyes. I mean the universe, but we cannot understand it if we do not first learn the language and grasp the symbols in which it is written. The book is written in the mathematical language, and the symbols are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without whose help it is impossible to comprehend a single word of it, without which one wanders in vain through the dark labyrinth. Also, like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo saw his task in explaining the true mathematical reality that existed beyond the world of appearances. Armed with these Pythagorean Platonic beliefs, Galileo set out to correct a number of misconceptions about the world and the heavenly bodies. He challenged Aristotle's contention that heavy objects fall faster than lighter ones. Okay. Because of their inherent tendency to do so by demonstrating both fall at the same rate. He accepted the Copernican heliocentric theory and wrote a book in which he demolished all arguments against it. In 1609, Galileo used his modified version of the newly invented telescope to discover the mountains of the moon, sunspots, and in fact that the Milky Way is made up of many stars not visible to the naked eye. He also discovered 4 moons of Jupiter, which meant that there were at least 11 bodies in the solar system instead of 7, claimed by the Church. Most people refused to look through Galileo's telescope because they believed that to do so was an act of heresy. Galileo shared one such experience with his friend Kepler. Oh, my dear friend Kepler, how I wish that we could have had one hearty laugh together. Here at Padua is a principal professor of philosophy whom I repeatedly and urgently requested to look at the moon and planets through my glass, which he pertinaciously refuses to do so. Why are you not here? What shouts of laughter should we have at this glorious folly, and here the professor of philosophy at Pisa laboring before the Grand Duke with logical arguments, as if with magical incantations to charm the new planets out of the sky. Others, refusing to look through Galileo's telescope, asserted that if God meant man to use such contrivance in acquiring knowledge, he would have endowed man with telescope eyes. And still others who did look through the telescope acknowledged the phenomenon observed and claimed that the new objects were not the sky at all, but were apparitions caused by the telescope itself. With his studies of the dynamics of projectiles, Galileo demonstrated that the motions of all bodies under all circumstances are governed by a single set of mechanical laws. His studies showed that the notions of animation were unnecessary for explaining physical events. That is, because the behavior of objects and events can be explained in terms of external forces. There is no need to postulate natural places, passions, ends, essences, or any other inherent properties. Before Galileo's time, much had been written on the subject of motion, but no one had actually measured the motions of falling bodies. When Galileo was born, 2,000 years of physics had not resulted in even rough measurements of actual motions. It's a striking fact that the history of each science shows continuity back to the first use of measurement, before which exhibits no ancestral but metaphysics. That explains why Galileo's science was so stoutly opposed by nearly every philosopher from his time, he having made it as nearly free from metaphysics as he could. That was achieved by measurements, made as precisely as possible with the means available to Galileo. or that he managed to devise. However, in his attitude towards experimentation, we again see Galileo's Pythagorean Platonic beliefs. From Galileo, discovering the physical law was like discovering Platonic form. Observation suggests that a lawful relationship may exist, and the experiment is performed to either confirm or disconfirm the possibility. Once a law is discovered, however, further experimentation is not necessary. Mathematical deduction is used precisely to describe all manifestations of law. Galileo believed that besides being useful in verifying the existence of laws, experiments could also function as demonstrations to help convince those skeptical about the existence of certain laws. Galileo then relied much more on the rational deduction than he did in experimentation. On the question of realism versus nominalism, he was clearly on the side of realism. Actual laws or forms existed, and those laws acted on the physical world. Like a true Platonist, Galileo said that the senses can provide only a hint about the nature of reality. The ultimate explanation of reality must be in terms of the rational order of things. That is, the ultimate explanation must be mathematical. Pythagoras would have been pleased. Objective and subjective reality. Galileo made a sharp distinction between objective and subjective reality. Objective reality exists independently of anyone's perception of it, and its attributes are what later in history are called primary qualities. Primary qualities are absolute, objective, and capable of precise mathematical descriptions. They include quantity, shape, size, position, motion, and rest. Besides the primary qualities which constitute physical reality, another type of reality is created by the sensing organism. This reality consists of what came to be called secondary qualities. Secondary qualities, which constitute subjective reality, are purely psychological experiences and have no counterparts in the physical world. Examples of secondary qualities include the experience of color, sound, temperature, taste, smell. According to Galileo, secondary qualities are relative, subjective, and fluctuating. Of primary qualities, like Plato's forms, we can have true knowledge. Of secondary qualities, there is only opinion and appearance. Although secondary qualities may seem as real as primary qualities, they are not. Primary qualities are real, but secondary qualities are merely names. We use this to describe our subjective, psychological experience. Hence, I think that these tastes, odors, colors, etc., on the side of an object in which they seem to exist, are nothing else than mere names, but hold their residence solely in the sensitive body, so that if the animal were removed, every such quality would be abolished and annihilated. Nevertheless, as soon as we impose names on them, we induce ourselves to believe that they also exist just as truly, really, as the primary qualities. Now, in the study of the physical world, secondary qualities are at best irrelevant. If the physical object hits another, the color, smell, taste of the object is irrelevant in determining their subsequent paths. For Galileo, it was physical reality, not subjective reality, that could be and should be studied scientifically. The impossibility of a science of conscious experience. Because so much of our conscious experience consists of secondary qualities, and because such qualities can never be described and understood mathematically, Galileo believed consciousness could never be studied by objective methods of science. Galileo's position marked a major philosophical shift concerning man's place in the world. Almost without expectation, all philosophers and theologians prior to Galileo gave humans a prominent position in the world. If there were good things and bad things in the world, and if there were changing and unchanging things in the world, those things also existed in humans. Humans were viewed as a microcosm that reflected the vast macrocosm. Till the time of Galileo, it had always been taken for granted that man and nature were both integral parts of a larger whole, but which man's place was the more fundamental. With Galileo, the view of humans changed, whose experiences that are most human, our pleasures, our disappointments, passions, ambitions, our visual, auditory, and olfactory experiences, are now considered inferior to the real world outside of the human experience. At best, humans can come to know the world of astronomy, the world of resting and moving terrestrial objects, physics. However, this knowledge can never be obtained by sensory experience alone. It can be attained only by rationally grasping the mathematical laws that exist beyond sensory experience. For the first time in history, we have a view of the human conscious experience as secondary, unreal, and totally dependent on our senses, which are deceitful. That is real, important, and dignified. What is real, important, and dignified was the world outside of man. Man begins to appear for the first time in history of thought as an irrelevant specter, an insignificant effect of the great mathematical system, which is the substance of reality. Thus, Galileo excluded from science much of what is now included in psychology and many modern natural sciences, refused to accept psychology as a science for the same reason. Let me highlight that. For the same reason that Galileo did not accept it. There have been many efforts to quantify cognitive experience since the time of Galileo. Insofar as these efforts have been successful, Galileo's conclusions about the measurement of secondary qualities were incorrect. How successful these efforts have been, however, has been and is widely disputed. As we've seen, Aristotle was Galileo's prime target. Using empirical observation and mathematical reasoning, Galileo discredited one Aristotelian truth from after another, thus attacking the very core of church dogma. At the age of 70, crippled by rheumatism and almost blind, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition and made to recant his scientific conclusions. He lived his remaining years under house arrest, and although his works had been condemned, he continued to write in secret. Galileo died January 9, 1642. It was not until October 31, 1992 that the Catholic Church officially absolved Galileo of his transgressions. With the work of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, the old materialistic view of Democritus was resurrected. The universe appeared the universe appeared to consist of matter whose motion was determined by forces external to it. God had become minimally important in the scheme of things, and now even in the place of man was seriously questioned. Are humans part of a natural world? If so, they should be explicable in terms of natural science. Or is there something special about humans that sets them apart from the natural world? And if so, how are humans special? And what special laws govern human behavior? And new science favored the view of humans as natural phenomenon. Newton's epoch-making accomplishments furthered the materialistic view of the universe and encouraged the generalization of the view of humans. Soon the universe and everything in it would soon be viewed as materialistic and machine-like, including people. Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, was born on December 25th, the year Galileo died, in a village of Woolsthorpe, England. His father died before Newton's birth, and when his mother remarried, he was sent to live with his maternal grandmother in a neighboring town. In school, Newton was a mediocre student, but showed great aptitude for building mechanical contrivances such as windmills and water clocks. When her second husband died, Newton's mother removed him from school and brought him back to the Woolsthorpe, hoping he would become a farmer. Recognizing his potential, one of Newton's teachers prevailed upon his mother to prepare Newton for entrance into Cambridge University. Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge in 1661 under the tutelage of Isaac Barrow, professor of mathematics, and obtained his degree 4 years later. Newton's greatest works, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, 1687 to 1995, was written in 18 months and was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. Newton was well aware of the fact that he benefited from the work of those who preceded him, and said, "If I have seen further, and it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." In Newton's case, those giants were Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. In 1703, Newton was elected the President of the Royal Society, and in 1705 he was knighted by Queen Anne. He was also twice a member of Parliament. It is interesting to note that with all his accomplishments, Newton cited his lifelong celibacy as his greatest achievement. Also, although we remember Newton most for his scientific achievements, he wrote much about the theology and alchemy much more about theology and alchemy than about science. For Newton, however, the three topics were inseparable. Like Galileo, Newton conceived of the universe as complex, lawful machine created by God. Guided by these conceptions, Newton developed differential and integral calculus. Leibniz made the same discovery independently. Developed the universal law of gravitation, and did pioneering work in optics. Newton created a conception of the universe that was to prevail in physics and astronomy for more than 2 centuries, until Einstein revised it. His method of verification, like those of Galileo, included observation, mathematical deduction, and experimentation. In Newton, who was deeply religious, we have a complete reversal of the earlier faith-oriented way of knowing God. Because God made the universe, studying it objectively was a way of understanding God. He agreed with most of the scholastics and with Copernicus and Kepler. Although Newton believed that God as a creator of the universe, Newton's work greatly diminished God's influence. God created the universe, set it in motion, but that exhausted his involvement. After Newton, it was but a short step to removing God altogether. Soon, deism, the belief that God created the universe but then let it be, became popular. For the deists, the design of the universe was God's work, but revelation, religious dogma, prayer, and all forms of supernatural commerce with God were considered fruitless. Similarly, It was only the matter of time before humans too would be viewed and analyzed with just another machine that operated in accordance with the Newtonian principles of physics. Perhaps Newton's most significant contribution to his universal law of gravitation, this law synthesized a number of previous findings, such as Kepler's observation of planetary motion is elliptical, and Galileo's measurements of the acceleration of falling bodies. According to the law of gravitation, all objects in the universe attract each other. The amount of attraction is directly proportional to the product of the masses of the bodies and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This single law was able to explain the motion of all physical bodies everywhere in the universe. Although the universe was a machine that God had created, it operated according to the principles that humans could discover. And Newton found that these principles could be expressed precisely in mathematical terms. Thus his very Pythagorean conclusion that God was a mathematician. Principles of Newtonian science. The powerful and highly influential principles of Newtonian science can be summarized as follows. Although God is the creator of the world, he does not actively intervene with the events of the world. Deism. It is therefore inappropriate to evoke his will as an explanation of any particular thing or event in the material world. Second, the material world is governed by natural laws, and there are no exceptions to these laws. Third, there is no place for a purpose in natural law, and therefore Aristotle's final causes must be rejected. In other words, natural events can never be explained by postulating properties inherent in them. Bodies fall, for example, not because of an inherent tendency to fall, but because of various forces acting on them. That is, as a Newtonian scientist, one must not evoke teleological explanations. And this fourth, Occam's razor is to be accepted. Explanations must always be as simple as possible. In the book 3 of his Principles, 1687, Newton gives this advice. We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. This is the same principle that led Copernicus and many of his fellow mathematicians to reject geocentric system in favor of the heliocentric system. Because with God, the simplest is always the best. So too should it be with mathematicians and scientists. Newton's conception of the universe could not have been simpler. Everything that happens can be explained in terms of space, consistency of points, time, consistency consisting of moments, and matter existing in space and possessing mass. And force. That which provides change, that which provides change in the motion of matter. Newton and his followers believed that the entire physical universe could be explained in terms of these four constructs. In fact, an explanation of any natural event meant restarting it mathematically in terms of space, time, matter, and force. Natural laws are absolute, but at any given time our understanding is imperfect. Therefore, scientists often need to settle for probabilities rather than certainty. This is because human ignorance, not because of any variance in natural laws. Classification is not explanation. To note that chasing cats seems to be a characteristic of dogs does not explain why dogs tend to chase cats. To understand why anything acts as it does, it is necessary to know the physical attributes of the object being acted on, such as its mass and the nature of the force acting on it. Again, No purpose of any type can be attributed to either the object or the forces acting on it. The success of Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton with empirical observation and mathematical deduction stimulated scholars in all fields and launched a spirit of curiosity and experimentation, and that persisted in the Western world until the present. Similarly, the success that resulted from viewing the universe as a machine was to have profound implications for psychology. Science had become a proven way of unlocking nature's secrets, and it was embraced with intense enthusiasm in many ways. Science has become the new religion. For centuries, the Church had been impressed on man the limitations of his own wisdom. The mind of God is unfathomable. God works in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. Man must be content with the partial understanding. The rest he must simply believe. For Galileo or Newton, such a restriction of human curiosity was unacceptable. The scientist was willing to concede that some things may be ultimately unintelligible except on the basis of faith. But as he stubbornly continued to observe, measure, and experiment, he discovered more and more of the puzzles of nature were becoming clear. He was actually explaining in natural terms phenomena that had hitherto been unintelligible. Small wonder, then, that the new science began to generate a faith that ultimately science would displace theology. There is little evidence that in the 16th and 17th centuries such faith was more than a dim hope. Nevertheless, the seeds had been sown. Scientists were uncovering more and more of the secrets of nature, and more explanations were now being given without benefit of clergy. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1629, was born into a distinguished political family in London. After studying 3 years at Cambridge, he moved to France, where he worked as an ambassador to England to practice law. And in 1584, he was elected to Parliament. Shortly after the publication of his new influential work, Novum Organum, or The New Method, 1620. He was impeached by Parliament by accepting bribes. He was levied a heavy fine, for which he never paid, and served a brief prison sentence of 4 days in the Tower of London. His forced retirement from legal and legislative matters at age 60 years of age, allowed him to concentrate on science and philosophy, and a number of significant books soon followed. Bacon was traditionally been listed as the main spokesman for the new science and its revolt against past authorities, especially Aristotle. His sharp wit and brilliant writing style have been tempted some to speculate that he was the true author of the Shakespearean plays. He was a contemporary of Galileo, followed Copernicus by almost 100 years, and was 35 years older than Descartes, whom we will consider next. Bacon was a radical empiricist who believed that nature could only be understood by studying it directly and objectively. Accounts about how nature should be, based on scripture, faith, and any philosophical or theological authority, would only hamper one's effort to learn how the world actually functions. Bacon authored the following satirical story, which clearly demonstrates his own positivistic approach and his disdain for authority. In the year of our Lord, 1432, where arose a grievous quarrel among the brethren over the number of teeth in the mouth of a horse. For 13 days the disruption raged without ceasing. All of the ancient books and chronicles were fetched out, and the wonder and ponderous erudition erudition, such as was never before heard in this region, was made manifest. At the beginning of the 14th day, a youthful friar of godly bearing asked his learned superiors for permission to add a word, and straightway, to the wonderment of the disputants, whose deep wisdom he sore vexed, he beseeched them to unbend in a manner coarse and unheard of, and to look in the open mouth of the horse and find the answer for their questionings. At this, their dignity being grievously hurt, they waxed exceedingly wroth, and joining in a mighty uproar, they flew upon him, and smote his hip and thigh, and cast him out forthwith. For, said they, surely Satan hath tempted this bold Nephite to declare unholy and unheard of ways of finding truth contrary to all the teachings of the fathers. After many days of grievous strife, the dove of peace sat on the assembly, and they as one man declaring the problem to be an everlasting mystery because of a grievous dearth of historical and theological evidence, therefore so ordered, the same writ down. Baconian science. Although Bacon and Galileo were contemporaries, their approach to science was very different. Galileo sought general principles, laws, that could be expressed mathematically, and from which deductions could be made, an approach that actually required very little experimentation. For Galileo, discovering the laws that governed the physical world was important. One such law had been isolated and expressed mathematically. A large number of manifestations of those laws could be deduced. Deduction involves predicting a particular event from a general principle. Bacon, on the other hand, demanded science based on induction. According to Bacon, science could include no theories, no hypotheses, no mathematics, and no deductions, but should involve only the facts of observation. He believed that anyone doing research with preconceived notions would tend to see nature in the light of those preconceptions. In other words, Bacon thought that accepting a theory was likely to bias one's observations. He offered Aristotle as an example of a biased researcher. Bacon said that because Aristotle had assumed that the objects in nature were governed by final causes, his research confirmed the existence of final causes. Bacon declared that when we assume final causes and apply them to science, we are carrying into nature what exists only in our imagination. Instead of understanding things, we dispute about words which each man interprets to suit himself. Bacon distrusted rationalism because of its emphasis on words. He distrusted mathematics because of its emphasis on symbols. He said, "Words are but the images of matter. To fall in love with them is like falling in love with a picture." Bacon trusted only the direct observation and recording of nature. With his radical empiricism, Bacon made it clear that the ultimate authority in science was to be observation. No authority, no theory, no words, no mathematical formulations, no belief, no fantasy could displace empirical observation as a basis of factual knowledge. Later in history, Bacon's approach to science would be called positivism. But Bacon did not avoid classifying empirical observations. He believed that many observations, generalizations could be made, and similarities and differences among observations noted. These generalizations could be used to describe classes of events or experiences. In Baconian science, one proceeds from observation to generalization or induction. In Galilean and Newtonian science, one proceeds from general law to the prediction of a specific empirical event, deduction. Bacon did not deny the importance of rational powers of the mind, but he believed that those powers should be used to understand the facts of nature rather than figments of human imagination. What Bacon ultimately proposed was a position immediate between traditional empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists, like ants, will merely collect things and use them. Rationalists, like spiders, spin webs out of themselves. The middle is the way of the bee, which gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and field, and then transforms and digests it by the power of its own. And the true business of philosophy is much the same, for it does not rely only or chiefly on the powers of the mind, nor does it store the material supplied by its natural history and practical experiments untouched in its memory, but lays it up in the understanding changed and refined. Thus, from the closer and pure alliance of the two faculties, the experimental and the rational, such has never yet been made. We have good reason for hope. According to Bacon, scientists should follow two cardinal rules. 1. To lay aside received opinions and notions, and the other, to restrain the mind for a time from the highest generalizations. Again, Bacon was not against generalization, only premature generalization. Bacon summarized the 4 sources of error that he believed could creep into scientific investigation in his famous idols. The idols of the cave are personal biases that arise from a person's intellectual endowment, experiences, education, and feelings. Any of these things can influence how an individual perceives and interprets the world. Imagine how the stereotypical hungry cowboy and the vegetation might each react to the prospect of seeing beef ribs served at a luncheon. The idols of the tribe are biases due to human nature. All humans have common abilities to imagine, to will, to hope, and those human attributes can usually distort perceptions. For example, it is common for people who see events as they would like them to be rather than how they really are. The modern philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, chapter 20, called these innate filters upon our judgments our form of life, and famously quipped that if a lion could speak, we could not understand him, because the experiences of the lion would be filtered by the non-human form of life. The idols of the marketplace are biases that result from being overly influenced by the meaning assigned to words. Verbal labels and descriptions can influence one's understanding of the world and distort one's observations of it. Bacon believed that many philosophical disputes were over the definitions of words rather than over the nature of reality. You might feel differently about some position if you learn it is backed by either the Democrats or the Republicans. Or, as Shakespeare's Juliet says of her Romeo, who she should not love just because he is a Montague. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The idols of the theater are biases that result from blind allegiance to any viewpoint, whether it to be philosophical or theological. An excellent demonstration of this is conducted by the 2 American psychologists Albert Hausdorff and Hadley Cantrill in 1954. Students were asked to watch a clip from the Princeton-Dartmouth football game, and when they answered questions about its rough play. When they reported seeing a hard-fought game or an unnecessarily dirty event, were highly correlated with which school they attended. Science should provide useful information. Bacon also thought that science could and should change the world for the better. Science would furnish the knowledge that would improve technology, and improved technology would improve the world. As evidence of the power of technical knowledge, Bacon offered the inventions of printing, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass. These three inventions have changed the whole face of the condition of things throughout the world, in literature, in warfare, and in navigation. From them, innumerable changes followed, so much so that no empire, no sect, no star has ever been to exert more power and influence over the affairs of men than have these mechanical discoveries. The practical knowledge furnished by science was so important for the betterment of society that Bacon believed that scientific activity should be generously supported by public funds. With his interest in practical knowledge, it is interesting that Bacon died on April 9, 1929, following complications from a chill he experienced after stuffing a chicken with snow in order to test the effect of cold temperatures on the preservation of meat. Although Bacon believed that science should always be judged by its practical consequences, he also believed that human knowledge and human power come from the same thing. For where the cause is not known, the effect cannot be produced. We can only command nature by obeying her. Thus Bacon reached his celebrated conclusion: knowledge is power. For Bacon, then, understanding nature precedes any attempt to command it. By understanding nature, Bacon meant knowing how things are causally related. Once these relationships are known, their practical implications could be explored. Bacon then proposed two different types of experiments: experimenta lucifera, experiments of light, an experiment designed to discover causal relationships, and experimenta fructifera, experiments of fruit, designed to explore how the laws of nature might be utilized. Whether it involved experiments of light or fruit, Bacon's approach to science was inductive. In both cases, one needed to guard against the idols. Experiments will yield nature's secrets and provide practical information only if they are formed correctly. For Bacon, this meant in an unbiased manner. Bacon was ahead of his time in insisting that scientists purge their minds of their biases. He was observing that scientists are humans too, and with anyone else, their preconceptions can influence their observations. Kuhn, in 1996, points out the same thing with his concept of a paradigm. Currently, it is generally agreed that the observations of the scientist or anyone else is theory-laden, and that is, one's theory influences what one observes and how one interprets what one observes.